My name is Fanny Brown. I was 30 when the courtroom air taught me what silence really sounds like. I remember the exact texture of the wooden bench beneath my palms, cool and slightly worn, the kind of cold that seeps into your fingers and stays there long after you've left the building. My ex-husband, Daniel, sat across the aisle with his lawyer, and beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, sat my sister, Renee. I hadn't expected her testimony. Nobody had warned me. There is a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself. It simply appears, dressed in a blouse you helped her pick out, speaking in a voice you used to trust with everything. Fanny was distant, she said, not looking at me. Overworked. Emotionally unavailable. Each word landed like a small stone dropped into still water, rippling outward until the whole room seemed to tilt. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I've read enough stories where the woman weeps beautifully at the moment of injustice, and that isn't what happened to me. What happened was quieter and stranger, a kind of internal folding, like a paper crane collapsing back into a flat, meaningless square. I thought about our childhood. The blanket fort we built during the July heatwave when I was 9, and she was 6. The way she used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, insisting she wasn't scared, just cold. I had believed, foolishly perhaps, that certain loyalties were permanent, that blood meant something steadier than convenience. The judge's ruling came down that afternoon, favoring Daniel on the shared custody schedule for our dog, Biscuit, and the lake house neither of us had visited in 2 years. It wasn't really about the dog or the house. It was about who the room believed. Renee found me in the parking lot afterward, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, keys jingling in her hand like nothing unusual had occurred. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "I just told the truth." I looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for some flicker of the girl who used to hold my hand crossing the street, and I found only a woman in a hurry to get somewhere else. "Okay," I said. That was all. "Okay." I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind erase whatever expression had settled onto my face. I didn't know yet that 3 weeks later, Renee would appear at my door with her 2 children and a duffel bag, asking, no, assuming, that she could stay. I didn't know yet what I would decide to do about that. But something in me, quiet and unhurried, had already begun to change. The knock came on a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary hour when I was reheating leftover soup and half-watching a documentary about coral reefs. I opened the door, and there she was, Renee, her eyes red-rimmed, her son Milo clutching a backpack shaped like a dinosaur, her daughter Ivy half asleep against her hip. "I need somewhere to stay," she said. "Just for a little while." There is a particular vertigo that comes from being needed by someone who recently discarded you. I felt it settle into my chest like a held breath. I could have said no. Some quiet, wounded part of me wanted to. But I looked at Milo's small, uncertain face, and something older than my anger stirred, an instinct I couldn't quite name. "Come in," I said. I want to explain something about the days that followed, because they weren't dramatic in the way people expect. There was no shouting, no confrontation with slammed doors. Instead, there was a strange, suspended politeness, Renee thanking me too formally for the coffee, me responding with the same brittle courtesy. We moved around each other like 2 people navigating a house full of furniture they no longer recognized. At night, after the children were asleep in the guest room, I would sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling untouched beside me, turning the same questions over and over. Why had she done it? Was it convenience, an easier path with Daniel's family, who had more resources, more connections? Was it resentment she'd carried since childhood? Something I had never noticed because I had been too busy building a life she quietly measured herself against. I found an old photograph one evening, tucked into a drawer I rarely opened. The 2 of us at 11 and 8, matching yellow raincoats, grinning with missing teeth. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put it away, not out of anger, but because I wasn't ready yet to let nostalgia soften what I needed to understand clearly. Milo started following me around the kitchen, asking questions about the coral reef documentary I'd left paused on the television. His curiosity was uncomplicated, untouched by the adult calculations happening around him. Ivy, still small enough to trust anyone who offered warm oatmeal, began reaching for me instead of her mother during breakfast. Renee noticed. I saw it in the tightening around her eyes. "They like you," she said one morning, and it wasn't quite a compliment. "They like the truth," I replied. "Same as anyone." She looked away first. I didn't yet know what shape my response to her would take. But I had begun, almost without meaning to, gathering pieces, memories, documents, quiet observations, the way you gather kindling before you understand what kind of fire you intend to build. The lake house came up again on a rainy Thursday, 3 weeks into Renee's stay. She mentioned it casually, buttering toast for Milo, as though the subject carried no weight at all. "Daniel's thinking of selling it," she said. "Might be smart. Split whatever's left." I set down my mug carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid you might otherwise throw. "There's nothing to split, Renee. The house was never in the settlement the way you implied in court." Her hand paused over the toast. "I didn't imply anything. I answered the questions I was asked. You volunteered an opinion about my character that nobody asked for." The kitchen went quiet except for the rain ticking against the window and Ivy humming softly to her stuffed rabbit in the next room. Renee's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw something almost like guilt flicker across her face before she smoothed it away. "You've always made everything about you," she said. "Even now. I'm sleeping on an air mattress with 2 kids because my marriage fell apart, and somehow we're back to your feelings." I could have argued. I could have listed the ways she'd misrepresented me under oath, the specific sentences that had cost me something real. Instead, I found myself studying her, really studying her. The exhaustion beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with me at all. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat with a box of old letters I'd found while cleaning out the hall closet, letters our mother had written to each of us separately before she passed, sealed and labeled, meant to be opened whenever we needed them. I hadn't opened mine yet. I wasn't sure why I hadn't. Perhaps some part of me was afraid of what comfort or accusation it might contain. I found Renee's letter too, unopened, tucked behind mine. I held it for a long time, debating. I didn't read it. Instead, I left it on her pillow the next morning, unmarked, without explanation. She found me later that afternoon, the letter held loosely in her hand, her eyes wet in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. "She knew," Renee whispered. "She knew I'd do something like this." I didn't ask what the letter said. Some things belong only to the person who receives them. "I'm not trying to punish you," I told her quietly. "I just need you to understand what you cost me before I decide what happens next." For the first time since she'd arrived, Renee didn't have a quick reply. I began writing things down, not out of malice, but out of a need to see the shape of what had happened clearly, laid out in my own handwriting instead of buried under the noise of hurt feelings. Dates. Conversations. The exact wording Renee had used on the stand, which I requested from the court transcript out of a calm, methodical curiosity rather than any desire for confrontation. Daniel called one evening while Renee was giving the kids a bath. His voice carried the particular smoothness of a man who believed he'd already won something. "I heard my sister-in-law's staying with you," he said, amused. "Ironic." "She's still my sister," I said. "That hasn't changed, whatever else has." There was a pause, as if he'd expected sharper bitterness and didn't know what to do with its absence. "Look," he said, "I didn't ask Renee to say anything in court. She offered." That detail settled into me differently than I expected. I had assumed, without fully examining the assumption, that Daniel had pressured her somehow, that her betrayal had been extracted rather than freely given. Hearing that she'd volunteered rearranged something in my understanding, made the wound feel less like an ambush and more like a choice she'd made with open eyes. I thanked him for the information and hung up before he could hear whatever was moving through my voice. That night, I asked Renee directly, without preamble, while she folded laundry at my kitchen table. "Did he ask you to testify, or did you offer?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands kept moving, folding Milo's small shirts into careful squares, buying herself time. "I offered," she finally said. "I thought if I helped him, he'd help me. He has money, connections. I thought it would matter for custody for," she stopped herself. "For you," I finished. Not for justice. For you. She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I felt something inside me settle, not into forgiveness exactly, but into clarity. This hadn't been a complicated tragedy of divided loyalties. It had been a transaction, and I had been the currency spent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw the folded laundry across the room, though some old, buried part of me imagined it. Instead, I simply said, I need you to find another place to stay by the end of the month. Renee looked up, startled, as though she'd assumed my quiet hospitality meant the matter was already forgiven. The kids need stability, I added softer now. Not staying here forever wasn't ever going to be that. But hurting me for convenience, that has consequences too. Even quiet ones.
She didn't argue.
Somewhere beneath her exhaustion, I think she'd been waiting for me to say it. Word of Renee's testimony eventually reached our extended family, the way these things always do. Not through confrontation, but through the slow drip of relatives who couldn't resist mentioning what they'd heard. Our Aunt Colette called first, her voice pitched somewhere between concern and gossip. Is it true Renee spoke against you in court? I considered lying, softening it, the way I'd been taught to smooth over family conflict since childhood. Instead, I told her the truth, plainly, without embellishment or exaggeration.
She did.
And now she's staying with me while she figures out her next steps. Colette was quiet for a moment. That's very generous of you. It's not generosity, I said. It's just what made sense at the time. I noticed, in the days that followed, that I no longer felt the need to perform forgiveness for an audience. There was no dramatic family intervention, no tearful reconciliation staged for anyone's benefit. What existed instead was something plainer and more honest. Two sisters navigating the wreckage of trust in the privacy of an ordinary house, with laundry to fold and children to feed. Milo asked me one afternoon, while we built a puzzle of the solar system together, why his mom looked sad so often lately. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people they love, I told him carefully, choosing words meant for a 7-year-old's understanding. And then they have to sit with that for a while before things get better. Did she hurt you? He asked, pressing a piece of Saturn into place. I hesitated. A little, but I'm going to be okay. He nodded, satisfied with the simplicity of that answer in the way only children can be. That evening, I opened my mother's letter at last. Her handwriting, familiar and slanted, filled the page with words I hadn't expected. Not instructions or warnings, but a simple observation. Asterisk, you've always carried more than your share, Fanny. One day you'll need to set some of it down, not out of anger, but because you deserve lighter hands, asterisk.
I sat with that for a long time.
The end of the month arrived. Renee had found a small apartment across town, modest but stable, close enough for the kids to stay in the same school. On her last evening in my house, she stood in the doorway of the guest room, watching Milo and Ivy sleep. Thank you, she said quietly, for not being cruel, even when you had every reason to be. I thought about it, I admitted, but cruelty isn't the same as consequence. I wanted you to feel the second one, not the first. Renee moved out on a Sunday morning, the kind of pale autumn light that makes everything look a little unfinished. I helped her carry boxes to her car, our movements practiced and silent, the way people work together after a storm has already done its damage, and there's nothing left to do but clean up. I didn't offer to keep in close touch. I didn't promise weekly dinners or forced reconciliation. What I offered instead was smaller and more honest, the truth that our relationship had changed shape permanently, and that whatever came next would have to be built slowly, without assumptions. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, Renee said, buckling Ivy into her car seat. I just needed you to know I understand what I did. I know, I said. And I did know. I could see it in the careful way she'd stopped minimizing, the way she no longer reached for excuses the moment silence stretched too long between us. After she left, the house felt strange in its emptiness, too quiet in the way a space becomes once it stopped absorbing the noise of small children. I sat at my kitchen table with my mother's letter still open beside me, and I thought about the word Renee had used in court. Distant. I turned it over, examining it from every angle, trying to understand whether there had been any truth buried inside her betrayal, some kernel of honest observation twisted into a weapon. Perhaps I had been distant, in my own way, during the last years of my marriage, consumed by work, by the slow erosion of a partnership that had already been failing long before any courtroom got involved. But distance isn't a crime. And even if it were, it wasn't hers to punish. I began seeing a therapist that winter, not out of desperation, but out of a quiet decision to understand myself more honestly than either the courtroom or my sister ever had. I talked about Renee. I talked about Daniel. But mostly, I talked about the version of myself who had spent so many years absorbing other people's needs that I'd forgotten to ask what I needed in return. Milo called me sometimes, using his mother's phone, to tell me about school projects or new facts about Jupiter's moons. Ivy sent crayon drawings through the mail, usually featuring a stick figure labeled Aunt Fanny, standing beside a sun that took up half the page. I kept them all in a drawer, alongside my mother's letter, a quiet collection of the parts of my family that had chosen, in their own imperfect ways, to remain close to me. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always does after a difficult season, not with dramatic transformation, but with small, accumulating evidence. Renee began calling occasionally, tentative at first, then gradually more comfortable, asking about my work, mentioning small details about her new apartment. We didn't discuss the trial directly again for a long time. Some wounds don't need to be reopened repeatedly to heal. They simply need enough space and honesty to close properly the first time. I ran into Daniel once, at a grocery store of all places, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee. There was an awkward politeness between us, the kind reserved for people who once shared a life and now share only logistics. "How's Renee?" he asked, an odd note of guilt threading through his voice. "Rebuilding," I said simply. "Same as me." He nodded, and something in his expression suggested he understood, perhaps for the first time, that his convenient alliance with my sister had cost more than it had gained him, not legally, but in the quieter currency of trust that people carry with them long after courtrooms empty out. I invited Renee to dinner in April, the first real invitation since she'd moved out. She arrived nervous, bringing a bottle of wine and an uncertain smile, as though testing whether the ground beneath us could hold weight again. We talked carefully at first, then more naturally, slipping into old patterns of conversation that neither betrayal nor time had fully erased. She told me about a promotion at work. I told her about a photography class I'd started taking, something entirely for myself, unconnected to anyone else's expectations. "I used to think you had everything figured out," Renee admitted, swirling wine in her glass. "That's part of why I said what I did in court. I wanted, just once, to be the one people believed." It was the most honest thing she'd said since the letter. "I never had it figured out," I told her. "I just carried things quietly. That's different from having answers." We sat with that admission for a while, the space between us no longer hostile, though not yet fully healed either. Healing, I was learning, doesn't arrive as a single moment of resolution. It accumulates, the way trust once did, in small deposits of honesty repeated over time. A year passed before I understood what closure actually felt like. Not the dramatic reckoning I might once have imagined, but something quieter, almost imperceptible, like a held breath finally released. I still had the photograph from our childhood, the two of us in matching yellow raincoats. I framed it that spring and placed it on the shelf beside my mother's letter, no longer hidden in a drawer. It felt important to let the good memory exist visibly alongside the difficult one, rather than choosing between forgetting and resentment. Renee and I built something new together, slower and more careful than what we'd had before, not the unconditional closeness of childhood, but a deliberate, adult kind of trust, rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. Milo and Ivy became a regular, welcome presence in my home again, though this time as visitors rather than refugees from a decision their mother had made. I never confronted Daniel further, never sought some dramatic reversal of the court's ruling. The lake house sold eventually, and I let the money go without much feeling attached to it. Some losses aren't worth chasing once you understand what they actually cost you, and what they didn't. What I gained instead was harder to quantify, but far more valuable. A clearer understanding of my own boundaries, a sister who had finally learned to speak honestly instead of conveniently, and a version of myself who no longer needed a courtroom or anyone else's testimony to know her own worth. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after the children fall asleep during their visits, I sit on my porch and think about that day in the parking lot. Renee's sunglasses pushed into her hair, her voice insisting she'd only told the truth. I understand now that she had told a truth, just not the whole one, and not for the reasons she claimed. I no longer feel the need to correct that record for anyone but myself. My mother's letter sits framed beside the photograph now, her words about lighter hands finally making sense to me in a way they hadn't during that first difficult winter. I did set something down eventually. Not my sister, not my anger, but the belief that I needed either revenge or approval to know I'd been wronged. I know it. I've always known it. And now, finally, that knowledge is enough.